because I inadvertently dropped a day on the previous version. I had left out for some reason February 26th. So that's been corrected, and the comment under classroom decorum about only meeting twice a week has been corrected, and I am sure there are other errors, so don't read it too carefully. Hopefully, no, that's where that happened. So I've just adjusted the syllabus a little bit. I essentially moved everything up one day and added a day, an additional day of reading for Neverwhere at the end, because it's probably the longest novel. A lot of pages and really small print compared to Sabriel, which has a lot of pages, but not really small print. So probably will take 5 days to do Gaiman, assuming we get there. We'll just have to wait and see. Okay. So we start with Tolkien's essay on fairy stories for a couple of reasons. As I suggested the other day, this is the key to understand J.R.R. Tolkien. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. That is, if you read this fairy story essay and you understand it, you will understand what Tolkien is doing, not only in The Hobbit, in The Lord of the Rings, but then if you gird yourself and take on something like the Silmarillion, which is not a single narrative arc. It is a collection of stories. Why? Because it's the mythological background for the creation of Middle-earth, essentially. Okay? And one of the reasons I do this is because Tolkien's pretty much the godfather of fantasy literature. I mean, people wrote fantasy before Tolkien. Previous incarnations of this class, I'd have students read Plato, because Plato has fantastic elements in some of his writings. We read Beowulf, okay? Predates Tolkien by 1,000 years, but Tolkien knew more about Beowulf than just about anybody alive while he was alive. And Beowulf kind of figures in, finds aspects of its fine way into Tolkien's work. So Tolkien kind of creates modern fantasy. And he does that with the publication in 1937 of The Hobbit. This is first published, I think it's 1945, might be 1946, and then it gets republished and revised in 1965. Okay? It's initially delivered as an oral lecture. Your book has a little note about that. It's delivered at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland, part of what's called the Andrew Lang Lectures, or the Andrew Lang Lecture for the year 1939, I believe. Tolkien was invited to do this because of the publication of The Hobbit. When The Hobbit was published, it made Tolkien internationally famous. Not internationally famous like an author today, like J.K. Rowling might be internationally famous, because one of the reasons Rowling's fame spread so quickly was because of the internet. Tolkien didn't have the internet. All he had to spread his fame was newspapers and a few international publications like Time and Newsweek. Okay? But when it was published in 1937, The Hobbit was quickly hailed, like within a year, as an instant classic. Okay? Instant classic is an oxymoron, because classic means it's passed the test of time. So how do you instantly pass the test of time? Well, you don't. Okay? And I'll talk, when we get to The Hobbit, I'll talk about how The Hobbit came to be. That is, how he came up with the idea for The Hobbit, how he actually got it published, etc. But for now, we're jumping up to the essay on fairy stories. So he begins by saying, if I'm going to talk about fairy stories, which I'm not a professor about, Tolkien says this. He says, I'm not a professional fairy story studier, okay? But he says, I've read them from my youth, and I love and enjoy them. So you've paid me to come up here, so I need to talk about something. So here are 3 questions. What are fairy stories? What are their origins? What is their use? Use. Like, how do you use Stephen King? do you mean, use? Okay? So he's going to address all three of these. And he spends quite a bit of time addressing the first two. And he essentially says, about this one, you can't define it. Okay, now, what does that word define literally mean? Keep in mind, Tolkien is a master of language. I mean, a true master. He knows, he's fluent in about a dozen languages. 12. Okay? And there are a few others that he reads, or has the ability to read. Okay? He plays with words. He's been in love with words almost from about the age of 8. Okay? While he's over there in France in World War I, fighting in the Somme, down in the trenches, when there would be a lull in action, he would pull out a little notebook and work on his dictionary of Gnomish, the language of the gnomes. And, work on word derivations and stuff. I mean, uber nerd. Okay? The word nerd was created essentially to describe Tolkien. So, go to the first one. What are they? He says it cannot be defined. Why? Because define means literally you put some kind of limit around it. And he says fairy stories cannot be limited in that way. Okay? They're not like mysteries. What must every mystery have? Mystery. Modern mystery. Like Agatha Christie or a John Grisham lawyer novel, because every John Grisham novel is a lawyer novel. Okay? Mysteries have to have mystery, obviously, but what kind of mystery? What are they also called by? Whodunits. Right? A crime's been committed, and you have to figure out who done it. Who did whatever the crime was. Okay? Those are what's called formulaic fiction. You always know that's going to be involved. In fairy stories, you don't always know what's going to be involved. Does every fairy story have a quote-unquote fairy in it? No. Does every fairy story have a dragon in it? Nope. Does every fairy story have a dwarf in it? Nope. Does every fairy story have a hobbit in it? Nope. Okay? So how can you call it a fairy story if it doesn't have a fairy in it? Well, Tolkien essentially says it's something about the kind of story. In fact, he says early on, the realm of fairy story is wide and deep and high and filled with many things. What kind of things? All manner of beasts and birds are found there. Shoreless seas and stars uncounted. Beauty that is an enchantment and an ever-present peril. Both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. In other words, if it's what Tolkien would consider real fairy story, it's got all of those elements. In that realm, a man may perhaps count himself fortunate to have wandered, but its very richness and strangeness tie the tongue of a traveler who would report them. That is, you go there into the realm of fairy story, but what you see is so mind-blowing. What happens when you quote-unquote come back to our world?
You can't describe it.
You can't describe it. Words fail. Okay? So, he says, while he is there, that is, while you're in this fairy story realm, it is dangerous for him to ask too many questions, lest the gate should be shut and the keys be lost. Why? I think what he really means there, because if you pull too hard on the threads of the story, what might happen? It unravels. How many of you have ever started a book before and it just didn't work? And you stopped. Game of Thrones. Very first book, Song of Fire and Ice. Okay? When it first came out, I had hardback first edition. I tried reading that probably 3 or 4 times. I think the most I got was 150 pages. And that was like work, real work to get into it. And I finally just said, I can't read this stuff. And gave away the book. Okay? didn't work for me. Not because I was pulling at the threads, but just because it didn't work inside my mind. Okay? So that's when Tolkien goes on and says, we've got to talk about these three questions. Okay? So he says, well, you look this up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and what does it say? It gives you a description, and it mentions characters of diminutive size. Like in Shakespeare's Midsummer Night's Dream, the way it's often interpreted, is that the fairies, the elves there, are little teeny tiny things. Why? Because they have names like mustard seed, cobweb. But in medieval literature, primarily of England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, where fairies do enter, or elves do enter, they're not small. They're our size. Okay? And they're not little cutesy things. They're dangerous. Really dangerous. Okay? So he eventually, in talking about what fairy stories are, he kind of comes up with the definition of, I can't define them, but I can tell you what one is. Or I can tell you if something is a fairy story. It's kind of like, I think it was William O. Douglas, Justice William O. Douglas's definition of pornography. When a pornography case came before the Supreme Court, he said, I can't define it, but I can tell you what it is. In other words, you show me stuff, and I'll say, pornography, art. Okay? But he couldn't say why this is pornography, why this is art. It's just, that's clearly porn, that isn't. Tolkien essentially does the same with these. For example, he would say C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia, not fairy stories. Why? Because those fall under the category of talking animal stories, of which there are a ton. Just because an animal talks doesn't mean you're in the realm of fairy story. Okay? He also will argue that because of how Lewis wrote them, there's problems with this. Okay, so let's go on to the next question. What are their origins? What's his ultimate answer? It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the origin of a story is. Okay? Here's an example. The Lord of the Rings. People have spent a lot of time and wasted a lot of ink discussing the origins of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, or even The Hobbit. For example, in The Hobbit, you have about a dozen dwarves. Okay? Where do they get their names from? Old Norse. There's an Old Norse document that has a list of names. Almost all of Tolkien's names comes from that list. In fact, even the wizard Gandalf's name comes from that list. So does that mean this Old Norse document is the source of The Hobbit? Nope. Similarly, the name Frodo comes from probably the Old English Beowulf poem, which has a character named Froda, F-R-O-D-A. Does that mean the source character for Frodo Baggins is Froda, son of ENGL? No. It just means that name had been around in Tolkien's mind for so long, he just pulls it and then modifies it slightly. Okay? He does say knowing aspects of origins, can be useful and informative, but only to an extent. And here's the analogy he comes up with. The cauldron of story. He says stories are like something that comes out of a big cooking pot. Notice, they're the things that come out of the pot, not the things that go into the pot. Okay? The things that go into the pot, Lord of the Rings again. The third volume of the Lord of the Rings is called The Return of the King. Okay? When Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, he intended it as one large book, ultimately to be titled The War of the Ring. That's it. One big, massive, thick novel. Like he is channeling his inner Russian, so to speak. Russian novelists write massively thick novels. Just read Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. It's like over 1,000 pages. Okay? But it's one book. The Lord of the Rings is one book. It's not a trilogy. But the publisher said, we can't publish this as one book. We got to break it up into 3. So Tolkien said, okay. 3rd volume became The Return of the King. The idea of the Return of the King says what? Where is the king before he returns? Missing, right? Otherwise it wouldn't be called The Return of the King. It'd be like the king's here, or the king's alive, or whatever. Well, where does that idea come from? Is there a mythological king in English history who went missing? King Arthur? According to English myth, according to most versions of English myth, where is King Arthur today? He's not dead. He's on the Isle of Avalon. And he's merely waiting for when England has its greatest need. So the Battle of Britain, 1940, 1941, during World War II. Nope, she didn't need me then. She had Churchill, he was handling it. Okay? The idea, the myth is, when the greatest need comes, Arthur will return. That's pretty cool when you think about it. Okay? Is that the earliest version of a missing king who will return? No. You got to go back from Arthur, at least 1,000 years, closer to 1,500 years. Yeah, and you got to move eastwards to Jerusalem. The Messiah, who is what? The King of Kings. But where is he? Not here. So it's the return of the king. Who was the king before the Messiah comes? Well, the Messiah is what? The son of David. David was the king. And then his son Solomon, blah, 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 blah. Okay? But now there isn't a king. And even Orthodox Jews will say the Messiah will return. Okay? It's been a long time. In The Lord of the Rings, when Aragorn becomes king, it's been a long time since there was another king, since the previous king, like a couple thousand years, okay, minimum. I think it's like 3,000 total. Okay, so this idea of the cauldron of story is that all these elements get added, and they just kind of cook and simmer over time, because every one of us could probably name, if we're talking about fantasy literature, some element. Give me an element that often shows up in fantasy literature. That is something that you see across stories. A journey? Joseph Campbell's written a book, okay, called Hero of a Thousand Journeys, something like that. And it's essentially Campbell's simplification of all stories. He says all stories, all these kinds of stories, have this, okay? And it's a hero, and the hero goes on a journey, and the hero has a mentor, and the hero often goes underground and comes back out of the ground. Why? Because it's death and rebirth. Okay? What does the hero sometimes have? What does Frodo Baggins wear on his finger sometimes? A ring that does what?
Make him disappear.
Okay, makes him invisible. What does Harry Potter have? That if he throws it on himself, he has an invisibility cloak. So notice, both of those stories have something that confer invisibility. It's this idea of something that confers invisibility that gets thrown into that cauldron. Okay? Because those aren't the other two stories that do that. There's a real long poem from medieval Germany called the Nibelungenlied. It's the Song of the Nibelungs. Okay? And in there is a ring that confers invisibility. But this idea of something that confers invisibility goes back to at least probably 1000 BC. We see it across cultures. We see it in Indian literature. Not Native American, but India, this kind of India. Okay? We see it in Russian or Slavic literatures. Okay? So there's something in the human consciousness that says, you know, invisibility would be cool. Okay? What else is there? Well, Aragorn has a sword. Once that sword is reforged, he's given a sheath, and the sword that is pulled out of this sheath will never break. So you have a weapon of invincibility. Arthur's is called Excalibur. Aragorn's is called Andúril. Harry Potter's is called the Death Stick, the Wand of Destiny, etc. Okay? That's another one of those elements. It gets thrown into the cauldron of story, and it comes out in different ways. So Tolkien says this is really more important than trying to come at origins, because he uses another metaphor for this. Let's say I told you all, next week, next Monday, don't eat breakfast. Maybe you don't eat breakfast anyways, but don't eat breakfast. I'm going to prepare breakfast for you, and it's going to be stew. I know you don't usually eat stew for breakfast, but play with me for a minute. Okay? And you all come in, and you're ravished. You didn't eat the night before. And you come in, and rather than having this wonderful smell meet your nostrils, instead you come in, and you see these two tables together, and there's a big slab of meat, and a big pot of water, and salt, and pepper, and carrots, and onions, and potatoes, and bay leaf, and a whole bunch of spices and stuff, all lined up. And I say, dig in. What do you think? One, Sherman's a moron, because he doesn't know how to cook. Because those are all what?
Ingredients.
Those are ingredients. By themselves, they don't necessarily taste that great. Okay? Mix them all together, let them cook for several hours, and you have something delicious. You take all the individual elements apart, and what do you have? The ingredients of a story. You don't have the story anymore. Okay? Gandalf will say in The Lord of the Rings, in response to Saruman, who says, I'm no longer Saruman the White, I'm Saruman of many colors. And his white cloak kind of shimmers, like he's wearing Joseph's the Amazing Technicolor coat. And Gandalf says, I liked white better. Saruman says, the white page can be overwritten. The white cloak can be dyed. The white light can be broken. Right? Get a prism, shine a white light through it, and what do you get? Roji Biv, the colors of the rainbow. Okay? And Gandalf replies, and he who would break a thing to learn what it is has left the path of wisdom. So, if you break a thing, a story, to learn what it is, you've left the path of wisdom. Why? That doesn't tell you what it is. Okay? I hate it when English professors say, oh, well, to understand this poem, you got to rip it apart. Understand all the meter, understand blah, 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 blah. Rather than seeing a poem as what? It is a whole. It's meant to be understood as a whole, not as merely a succession of parts. Okay? So, what are their origins? Tolkien ultimately says, doesn't matter. So he does away with these two questions. The third one, however, that's the one he's interested in. What is their use? Well, what does he mean? We still have fairy stories today. And I don't mean, you're going to the library, going to the bookstore, buying something for your niece, nephew, child, etc. I mean, we still have fairy stories today, and we have them in popular culture. We have them in film. What are the highest grossing films of all time?
Star Wars.
Star Wars, Marvel films, Harry Potter films,
Avatar.
Titanic, Avatar. Titanic is not real, by the way.
The Hobbit.
It's not fairy story, but it's not. Okay. Almost all of them are fairy stories of one sort or another. Star Wars is not science fiction. Star Wars is fantasy. Alien is science fiction. Star Trek is science fiction. What's the difference between Star Trek and Star Wars? It's this.
Star Trek doesn't really have a overarching journey.
Okay, Star Trek doesn't really have an overarching journey. Possible.
Of course.
Yeah. It's the scene in the first Star Wars where Obi-Wan is training Luke. Okay? And Han Solo's sitting back there playing with his blaster. And he says what? Hokey religions and old weapons are no match for a good blaster. Well, it's the hokey religion and the archaic weapons that what? Win the day. It's this trust in this nebulous force. Okay? That's not science fiction. Because science fiction is predicated on what? The first part of the phrase. Science. Which leads to technology. Where's the science fiction in Star Wars? It's on the Empire side. It's the trust in the Death Star. Okay? Remember what Darth Vader says about the Death Star? You know, it doesn't matter ultimately. Okay? So, what is their use? Why do we still need fairy stories today? Why do we still need, as shown by ticket sales, Captain America, Spider-Man, Batman, they're all what? Superheroes. Why do we need superheroes? Are our lives so dead, drab, and dull? Do we not have any real excitement in our own lives that we have to look to these others? Or is it that they represent or stand for something else? Okay? So, what is their use? Tolkien's going to rephrase that. He rephrases that to, what, if any, are the values and functions of fairy stories now? Now, okay? 1939, England, or 2018, America. Escape? Well, that's over here. Okay. These are the answers to what are the values and functions now. But he takes a while to get at that. He talks about this, which I'm going to actually, I think, skip over, because he talks about the imagination, because the term fantasy implies a variety of things. And he uses the term to cover all of this. You know, every one of you, you're going to write, how many did I say? A couple of exams. 3 exams, okay? You're going to have a variety of topics. You choose one. So when you get those topics and you choose one, you're going to come up here through your imagination with a thesis. That's your idea, your image. And then you're going to make what Tolkien would call a subcreation. Your paper. That's for me. Okay? Your subcreation is not a quote-unquote artistic, fictional subcreation. You're not creating a new world that I can enter with my mind, right? Because you're going to be making an argument about something. You're not writing a piece of poetry or a piece of fiction. But getting from the idea up here to the written paper down here will take this, art. Right? Because I'll bet almost every one of you, when you write your paper up here, when you turn it in, you're probably thinking, most of you, some of you will be honest, you're probably thinking, this is good, this is damn good. This is a good paper, I should get an A on this. And it's going to come in my hands, and I'm going to start marking it, and you're going to get it back, and it might be an A, it might be B, it might be a D, whatever it is. What's going to happen is your idea may not make it all the way clear through the process of being created up here and finding its expression out here. Why? Because we are not able, none of us are Vulcans. We're not able to do mind melds. I'm not able to put my hand on his forehead and go, oh, that's brilliant. I understand now. A. Nope. Just like, this is actually, I think, the third version. I could probably keep working on it and make it better. All right? So all that's part of fantasy. Secondary world. What does Tolkien mean by secondary world? Middle-earth. Hogwarts. That is, it's someplace not real. But when you're reading, hopefully, that place becomes real or seems real. First time I read The Lord of the Rings, I got about 50 pages in, put it down. I like The Hobbit, but I just couldn't get into The Lord of the Rings. I think it took me 3 times. And the third time, I was hooked. And I literally read through the whole thing in about 24 hours. Okay? And when Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli were chasing after Merry and Pippin through the fields of Rohan, I was running right alongside. I mean, I was their hook, line, and sinker. Okay? Why? Because Tolkien created a world that I could enter. And people could be talking to me and I would be completely oblivious to what was going on around me. And he does it in such a way, it works. It doesn't fall apart. See, Tolkien, of all of these authors, Tolkien's the most technically perfect. What do I mean by that? He ties up his loose ends. J.K. Rowling is probably, with George MacDonald, maybe the least technically perfect. Rowling is a great storyteller. She's not a good writer. If we were doing all the Harry Potter stories, I would point out all the flaws. And they're big flaws. Some of them are flaws big enough you could drive a tank through. Okay? Where she makes a statement at one point, and 2 sentences later, for example, in one of the books, she has a character die. And when he dies, he's standing next to Harry Potter. And so he dies and falls. He's still next to Harry Potter, like 6 feet from him. And a paragraph later, he's now 20 feet away. Harry hasn't moved. Neither has the dead guy. But now he's 20 feet away. Okay? That's bad writing, first of all. It's even worse copy editing. Bloomsbury should have fired that copy editor once they heard about that, if they ever heard about it. I don't know if they have or not. But Tolkien says the secondary world has got to follow its laws. That is, the laws that the author creates for it. Okay? This is where Rowling is bad. Because she creates laws, but then has people violate them all the time. For example, you have to have a wand to do advanced magic within the Harry Potter universe. And yet, Fred and George Weasley, 2 of Harry's friends, when they were 5 years old, and you have to be trained in order to do advanced magic, like transfiguration, like turning this water bottle, if I wanted to, into an armadillo, which could be done. Okay? But it takes training. But 2 brothers, when they're 5 years old, turn their 3-year-old brother's teddy bear into a giant spider. How the hell do 5-year-olds do that? I mean, you would think by the time they're 7 or 8, they're, running the show, but they're not. That's a problem in following the laws of the given world. Okay? Okay, so later on in the essay, after Tolkien deals with all of these, and he's talking about their use, he talks about children. Why? Because everybody thinks, I'll bet the first day when you came in and you saw the word fairy stories, you were thinking, what the is going on? We're not here to read fairy stories. I'm not here to, read Hansel and Gretel or Little Red Riding Hood. Fairy stories is fantasy literature. So Tolkien asks the question, what's the connection of fairy stories with children? Because everybody assumes fairy stories are meant for children. Hansel and Gretel is for children. Snow White is for children. Cinderella, the Disney catalog, it's for children. Because I don't think you could pay an adult to watch Little Mermaid. I had a niece who loved Little Mermaid. We were all together once for one Christmas, and I'm not kidding, that damn movie was playing just constantly to where I'd want to kill myself, almost, if I walked into the room where, Ariel was singing or something. So why have children become associated with fairy stories? Tolkien says this is an accident of the 19th century. Okay? Prior to the 19th century, the stories that we call fairy stories weren't appreciated in written and spoken for children. They were for adults. They began as what? Campfire stories, or stories around the hearth, okay, to while away the time at night before one turned in. Like Beowulf, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, okay? The Arthur stories were probably begun this way. So how did they get associated with children? Well, Tolkien says that happened in the mid-19th century, about the same time as we began thinking of children not as just small adults, but as kind of totally distinct, separate creatures. A totally different kind of being. Okay? And he says, well, what else happens about that time? You get the development of what he calls the nursery. Right? Not kid's bedroom, but the place where the children have reign. Think of the bedroom in, for example, Peter Pan, that Peter, John, and Wendy all sleep. They have all their toys there and everything. Tolkien says in the 19th century, what happens along with the children having that room is the old furniture that the adults no longer want to keep downstairs, that gets put upstairs. Why? What are the kids going to do with that old couch? They're going to jump up and down and bounce on it and have all kinds of fun. Why? Because the adults don't care. Same thing happens with this kind of literature. It gets given to the children because what else is going on in the 19th century? Well, you had the Enlightenment begin about 100 years earlier, the 18th century, which is also called the Age of Reason. Not the Age of Fantasy. Not the Age of Fairy Tales. Not the Age of Myth. Okay? So with an increased emphasis on reason, rationality, stories that seem to be not about reason and rationality, well, we'll just give those to the children. Why? Children are naturally what? Imaginative. What else? Gullible. You can tell them anything and they'll believe you. Okay? The younger they are, hook, line, and sinker. You tell a 4-year-old that there's a boogeyman under his bed, and if he gets out in the middle of the night, the boogeyman will eat him. And you tell him that several times. Guess what? The kid's not going to get out of bed in the middle of the night. Because he's going to be afraid something under the bed's going to get him. Okay? But we adults, we know there's no such thing as a boogeyman. Or is there? So he says, no, this literature is not naturally for children. It's for us. It was written for us. Its origins are for us. Okay? And he makes this statement. Creative fantasy is founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun, on a recognition of fact, but not slavery to it. You know, what does he mean by that? Take it apart. Creative fantasy, the kind of stuff he's talking and writing about, Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter, etc., are founded upon the hard recognition that things are so in the world as it appears under the sun. What does that mean? Things are so in the world as it appears under the sun. Things are what they seem. Is there racism in the world? Yes, there is. Is there prejudice in the world? Yes, there is. Is there hunger, poverty, war, disease? Yes, there is. In other words, creative fantasy is not, Tolkien is suggesting, escapist in that sense. It's based upon the world as we know it. Is there love, joy, beauty, truth in the world? Yes, there is. Okay? So, it's founded upon, notice, the hard recognition. Why? Because sometimes we don't want to accept this is the way the world is. We don't want to accept that there's injustice. We don't want to accept that there's poverty. We don't want to accept that 5-year-olds die of stray bullets, or cancer, even, or hunger, even. But they do, all too often. Okay? It's based on a recognition of fact. Notice, but not slavery to it. What does the not slavery to it mean? It's not limited to only that. You probably read, you may have read, sometime in high school or another time, Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye would fit all this, but remove that. Catcher in the Rye is what's called realist fiction. Why? Life sucks, and then you die. Change the vowel in the bumper sticker, life's a beach. It's life's a bitch, and then you die. Okay? Or Catch 22, or any of almost 90% of what is written in the late 20th century. Okay? That says, no, we are slaves to our reality. What does that mean? You can't change it. By saying this, Tolkien is saying, what is one of the purposes of creative fantasy? Change reality. How do you change it? By acting as though it doesn't exist? By acting as though slavery isn't today. You know, January 22nd, 2018, slavery is real. Even in the United States. Okay? Sex trafficking. Or if you want to talk about the other kind of slavery, think of the mess that we created in Libya. Where today, blacks are being bought and sold in Libya. Just as they were 200 years ago. Okay? That's on us, by the way. That's the United States. Okay? So what does he mean? How can we change it? This is what has to change first. Okay? So how do you do that? It's part of this. Okay? Fantasy offers adults. We get out of here. What time? 10:05. I haven't taught on a Monday, Wednesday, Friday schedule in 20 years. Fantasy offers adults, he says. He says it's to be written, it's for adults. Let me give you the exact statement he says. If adults are to read fairy stories, this is page 67. If adults are to read fairy stories, it's a natural branch of literature. Neither playing at being children, nor pretending to be choosing for children, nor being boys who would not grow up. That's Peter Pan. Why does Peter Pan not leave Neverland and go off with the Lost Boys? Back with Wendy, Peter, and John. Why?
Excess fairy dust.
No, it's not because he can't grow up. He doesn't want to. Why not?
He likes being a boy.
What happens when you grow up?
Shit happens.
Okay, yeah, that happens. What else? Responsibility. You gotta show up for class. You gotta show up for work. Okay? What else? Nor being boys who would not grow up. What are the values and functions of this kind? What are the values and functions of this kind of literature now for us? Not for my children, all of whom are grown up. My youngest is 16. But they're all raised on this kind of stuff. He says, if written with art, that is technical ability. Okay? They share the prime value that all literature shares. He never says what that prime value is, by the way. But he says, but they offer in a peculiar degree or mode these things for adults. Fantasy, recovery, escape, consolation. What does he mean by fantasy? He calls it arresting strangeness. Nobody in here other than me is old enough to remember when the first Star Wars came out. How mind-blowing that was. In the spring of 1977, to go into a movie theater when Dolby Sound was brand new, but to go into a movie theater and have a spaceship, well, first of all, to have words come from the bottom of the screen and move off into infinity in the background. But then have a spaceship come from the top of the screen and come down over, and have that spaceship not be all shiny white like it just rolled off the car dealership, like Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey spaceships were in 1968. No, that big old Star Destroyer had what? Had blast marks on it. It's dirty. It's got a few 100,000 miles on it, in other words. Okay? That was totally different. Arresting strangeness. In a hole in the ground, this book begins, there lived a hobbit. Excuse me, what? There lived a what? Nobody knew what the word hobbit was. Tolkien didn't know what the word hobbit was. When in the summer of 1931, he's grading exams for students to get into Oxford, he turns a page in a blue book and he writes in pencil, in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit. He didn't know what a hobbit was when he wrote that. It just popped into his mind and he wrote it. And he went on grading the rest of the students' exam. And that phrase stuck with him, so he starts to figure out what it means by creating a story that he begins telling his children. And they ask questions, and that helps him flesh things out, etc. Okay? So it's really this arresting strangeness. It's dealing with things that don't exist in our world. That's this idea of subcreation. Because none of us, Tolkien says, is really a creator. Why? He's Catholic. There's only one God. There's only one creator. You know, it's like Cap says in the one Avenger movie, you know. There's only one God, man, but I'm pretty sure he doesn't dress like that, okay? There's one creator. Everything we make with what? Stuff he made. Colors, textures, pigments, materials, etc. Okay? So then he goes on to this. Recovery. What's he mean by recovery? Regaining of a clear view. Why? Why do we need to regain a clear view? What does that imply? That we've lost it. That none of us see clearly now. We're all wearing glasses, and they're all dirty. Every one of us. So what do we need to do? We need to clean our lenses. How? Well, Tolkien says this is one of the things fantasy does. How does it do that? It makes us see things differently. It makes us pay attention to particulars. And he specifically talks about family, our loved ones in that section. Why? Because he says it's our family that we do what with? We take most for granted. Our familiars, as he calls them. Our loved ones, our friends. We take most for granted. Why? We see them every day. Or maybe nearly every day. Well, what happens when you see something and do the same thing every day, day in, day out, for years? It becomes merely rote. Okay? So Tolkien is saying, what we need to do is we need to see others, our familiars, as separate from ourselves. I'm not wearing my wedding ring because my fingers are swollen. He means I need to see my wife of 32 years the way I saw her before we were married. Like when I first saw her, I thought, whoa. Rather than, ball and chain. Okay? Why? because I've seen her nearly every day, day in, day out. So he says, I need to learn to wash these off and see her not as wife, but as separate. I need to see my kids, not as my kids, but as separate from me. Tolkien takes that down to the minute particulars, such as walking into this classroom, as opposed to walking into the classroom next door, I think it's next door, and noticing, for example, the walls are different. These have this ugly, god-awful, I don't even know what this stuff is, padding. It's like soundproofed. But nearly all the other classrooms in this building have what here? So that I can punch that pretty hard. It doesn't hurt. Or I can bang my forehead again. It wouldn't hurt. But one of those other classrooms, I do that, I'm going to go to the emergency room. Why? Because they're concrete block. And not only are they this ugly stuff, but they have these dividers between, which we could probably, pull apart. We got the ceiling with individual seating. In other words, paying attention to the details of life. Because what do we tend to do? I've seen it, I've registered it, I've put it away in my little categorical box in my mind. That's it. Myself, as teacher, and I'll stop with this, need to, Tolkien would say, when students come in and fill in a classroom, I need to just not see students, individuals. That's why it's important for me to learn your names. Because you're not just a group. Even though everything in our society says, look at people as groups, not as individuals. Okay. All right, we'll stop there. We'll pick up with recovery. We're going to finish the fairy story essay and Leaf by Niggle on Wednesday.